Hey there, I'm Gerald DeMattia, and this is Importing Awesome, a show all about video game experiences that have never come stateside. Ironically enough, we're talking about 3 Konami games that did come to the US, but not exactly in the form that their developers had intended. Imagine CastleVania 3 and Contra being better than they already are, or Bayou Billy actually being good. Let's talk about some of the changes made to these games during the localization process and why they were changed at all. Check any list of the top 10 best NES games, and you're sure to find a spot reserved for Contra. If it's not there, then simply put, that list is wrong. There's a number of reasons why Contra became a standout title in a library of over 700 games. In contrast to many other releases, its box art that oozed testosterone didn't mislead buyers by misrepresenting the game contained within. Instead, Contra gave players exactly what they were looking for, a game packed with action, extraterrestrial enemies, and 2 gun-toting Adonises blowing things up in a jungle. With an added bonus, they tore their shirts off to do it. Let's not forget about the game's tight controls, cooperative multiplayer, and soul-crushing but fair difficulty that kept us coming back for more. All these elements combined to make Contra a classic. But despite its popularity with NES owners, Contra, the game that reveled in the machismo of 1980s pop culture, is a lesser experience on the Nintendo Entertainment System when compared to its release on the Japanese Famicom. Stocked on shelves only a week after the NES version, the Famicom release of Contra sported Konami's custom-made VRC2 multi-memory chip. Via a technique known as ROM bank switching, the VRC2 multi-memory chip increased the amount of usable memory addressable by the Famicom's processor and made the game prettier. Although the gameplay is identical between versions, the Famicom release of Contra had a much more impressive presentation. Japanese players were treated to an introductory cutscene, as well as animated status report screens in between levels. In addition, certain stages featured animated backgrounds. The palm trees in Stage 1 swayed via several eye-catching frames of animation. Stage 5 featured a blizzard, and the entirety of Stage 7 squirmed in an alien-like manner. Other notable features included a slightly altered ending sequence, and even a secret message after the credits. The North American release of Contra would never see these additions due to the limited capacity of its Nintendo-made Unrom chip. Although Contra had major changes made to its presentation, what made the game fun at a fundamental level was left completely intact. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the localization of Mad City. Released on the Famicom in August of 1988, Konami's Mad City had players assuming the role of Billy West, survivalist and former soldier, as he attempts to rescue his girlfriend, Annabelle, from the clutches of the crime boss, Godfather Gordon. Mad City was unique. Most 8-bit releases confined themselves to a single genre. Mad City, on the other hand, melded a variety of gameplay experiences together, making for an extremely dynamic release. Mad City took inspiration from games like Double Dragon, with beat-em-up stages, Rad Racer with driving levels, and Operation Wolf, with on-rail shooting stages that were compatible with the NES Zapper. Following a year-long wait, Mad City made its way stateside as The Adventures of Bayou Billy, and proceeded to swamp gamers with a wave of frustrations. The localization process brought with it a substantial increase in the game's difficulty. Enemy AI was rewritten with an increased level of bloodlust. Enemies aggressively charged at Billy with little concern for their own well-being. But then again, there are reasons for the increased level of confidence. Enemies in Bayou Billy take a substantially larger amount of hits before going down. To make matters worse, less ammunition was given during the shooting stages, meaning players are required to have near-perfect aim to see them through to the end. Furthermore, narrowed roads and increased hazards were awaiting Billy on the driving stages. And of course, the life bar present in Mad City on these driving levels was completely removed, meaning one false turn could send Bayou Billy to an early grave. The reward for enduring Bayou Billy's brutal level of difficulty? One ending versus the 5 found in Mad City. However, NES owners had the luxury of rescuing a sexied up Annabelle, but the misogynistic bait ain't worth the trouble. The insane jump in difficulty did not endear Bayou Billy into the hearts of NES owners. The game has since become the butt of many jokes, and a reminder that Konami's famous silver boxes sometimes contained a brown turd. Both Contra and Mad City had major changes made to them for their US releases, but the most were made to Akamaju Densetsu, or Demon Castle Legend. The third in the series following Akamaju Dracula and Dracula 2, Norore no Fuen, Akamaju Densetsu was not only a prequel to its predecessors, but a much welcomed return to form after a mixed reaction to Dracula 2. Expanding on the formula of the original, Akamaju Densetsu had much larger levels that ended in branching paths. Depending on the path taken by the player, Akamaju Densetsu's whip-wielding main character, Ralph Belmondo, could find, recruit, or dismiss up to 3 additional playable characters, each with their own unique abilities: the magic-casting Sypha Fernandez, the son of Dracula, Alucard, and the dagger-throwing Grant Dynasty. But the biggest addition to Akamaju Densetsu was the use of the BRC6 coprocessor. The game's audio programmer, Hidenori Maezawa, assisted in the development of the chip, and used it to greatly enhance the sound capabilities of the Famicom, adding 3 additional sound channels to the console's pre-existing 5. Akamaju Densetsu appeared in Japanese stores on December 22, 1989. It would release in America on September 1st, 1990, as Castlevania III: Dracula's Curse. Like previous Castlevania games, it had minor aesthetic changes made to it. Changes to the game's presentation included new enemy sprites and toned down nudity, as if 8-bit wasn't toned down enough. The main characters' names were localized. Ralph was given the much cooler moniker of Trevor, and Sypha Fernandez became Sypha Belnades. However, like Contra before it, Castlevania III was unable to make use of the custom-developed chip found in the Japanese release. Therefore, drastic alterations were made to the game's soundtrack in order for it to work within the Nintendo's 5-channel limit. But the changes didn't stop with the sound. Like with Bayou Billy, Konami made adjustments to Castlevania III's difficulty, perhaps proving that Konami has just always hated gamers. For starters, tweaks were made to the amount of damage dealt by enemies. In Akamaju Densetsu, each enemy type deals a different amount of damage to the player, so regardless of whether a player is hit by a Medusa head in an earlier level like the Clock Tower, or one much later in the game like the Castle Keep, they will always take the same amount of damage. This keeps the game's difficulty balanced throughout. On the other hand, we have Castlevania III's way of doing things, where all enemies do the same amount of damage, but exactly how much is determined by how far the player is in the game. This makes Castlevania III's earlier stages relatively easy when compared to later ones, because a normal enemy and a boss will do the same minuscule amount of damage. But its final stages are much more difficult, as Trevor and his companions are left with a single block of health after just 3 hits from any given enemy. Needless to say, this makes Dracula's harder to deal with servants, like Medusa heads, much deadlier, and the game itself much more challenging. Other changes were also responsible for making Castlevania III more difficult. In Akamaju Densetsu, Grant Dynasty was more like Grant the Nasty, with his highly useful ability to throw knives. In Castlevania III, this was changed to a faster but extremely short-ranged stab. Alucard was also a little less vampiric in Akamaju Densetsu, draining hearts when using his special abilities at a slower rate than in Castlevania III. Moreover, the Dark Lord himself reigned a little less supreme in Akamaju Densetsu. The encounter was slightly easier, and on the off chance the player was felled in battle, they had the luxury of restarting just outside the throne room. In Castlevania III, Dracula's final form fired his already hard to dodge lasers more often and in more erratic patterns. The size of each beam was increased, leaving the player less room to work with. If Trevor and his companion fell in battle, which, given the circumstances, was likely, they were punished for their insolence and sent back to the beginning of Castle Keep's second section. Luckily, NES owners could still beg for mercy by typing "help me" on the password screen. This code granted players an extra 10 lives at the start of the game. At least they still let us have that. So we finally arrived at the big question. Why were these changes made? It may be hard to believe, but the actions of Konami in the 1980s are easier to explain than the actions of Konami in 2015. When it comes to the hardware changes, many point to Nintendo's strict obsession with quality control. In 1983, a lack of regulation and a deluge of bad games led to an industry-crippling crash. Nintendo hoped to avoid history repeating itself by limiting the number of games a publisher could produce to only 5. To enforce this restriction and make themselves a whole lot of money, Nintendo would handle all cartridge production. This left no room for third-party hardware in the US, like the VRC-2 found in the Japanese release of Contra. Japan didn't feel the effects of the video game crash of 1983. While Atari was preparing to usher ET off to a landfill in New Mexico, Japan saw the release of 3 major home consoles in just 2 months. So Japanese publishers, at least the ones close to Nintendo, were free to develop their own cartridges and custom chips. But even without Nintendo of America's restrictions, custom sound chips like the BRC-6 found in CastleVania 3 would not have been possible on the Nintendo Entertainment System. The Famicom and NES can be likened to siblings born only a few years apart, but the truth is, they are more like cousins with fundamental hardware differences. The Famicom's 60-pin cartridge slot, although smaller than the NES's 72, has 2 unique pins that allow the console access to external sound chips. Nintendo used these pins to give the Famicom access to the disk system's FN sound synthesizer, which allowed disk system games to have better sound quality than cartridge releases. This was one of several major selling points of the add-on that would be outdone by advancements in cartridge technology. So these pins are missing from the NES's cartridge slot. Where did they go? I wish I could say that they just walked away, that would be easy, but the real answer is a lot more complicated and has to do with Nintendo's market condition fears, the Famicom to NES redesign, the messy setup of the disk system, and what that meant for bringing it to the US. Let me take you on a walk. Connecting the Famicom to the disk system required a cumbersome RAM expansion be inserted into the console's cartridge slot. From there, a long black wire ran from the RAM adapter to a port on the back of the disk system. This already unwieldy design would not have worked well with the Nintendo Entertainment System, which at the time was being redesigned to look more like a VCR, complete with a front-loading cartridge slot. This meant that any plans to launch the disk system stateside would have ended in an unsightly wire jutting from the front of the Nintendo's hulking gray box. In spite of this, Nintendo deemed the redesign necessary because, thanks to the crash of 1983, Americans and retailers alike feared anything that resembled a video game console. But Nintendo believed that the disk system was important to the company's future in both Japan and America. So to do away with the unsightly wire and perhaps cut costs, the R&D team took the disk system's messy setup into consideration when creating the VCR-like Nintendo Entertainment System. Nintendo moved the 2 sound pins in the Famicom's cartridge slot to an expansion bay located on the underside of the Nintendo Entertainment System. With that one change, third-party developed sound chips, like Konami's VRC-6, became an impossibility on the newly designed console. On the bright side of things, Nintendo had effectively lowered the manufacturing cost for an add-on that would never see the light of day in America. Quality control and hardware changes were out of the hands of all third-party publishers, but crushing their little faces with brutal difficulty certainly was not. There isn't a single right answer as to why some games were made harder for US audiences, but I have an assumption.
Blockbuster, are you game enough?
Renting video games in Japan is illegal. Fearing the practice would cut into profits, Nintendo and its army of lawyers stamped out the act of renting games early in the Famicom's life cycle. Nintendo brought several lawsuits against Blockbuster, but the hearings did not swing in their favor. It is a possibility increasing the difficulty of certain titles was seen as a deterrent against kids renting and beating games in a single weekend. Turning up the difficulty was the DLC and online passes of the NES era. That does it for this episode of Importing Awesome. If you know about any other differences between the American and Japanese versions of these games, leave it in the comments below. And I know, this episode was really long. I'm going to try and make future installments shorter. But if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. And if you want to know when the next one's coming out, try subscribing to the channel. It's going to be on the 3 C's: capitalism, communism, and Contra. That one's probably going to be pretty long too.